My name is Steve. I'm 42 years old, and for the past 18 years, I've been married to a woman named Jessica. Our relationship started off strong, like most do, filled with love, passion, and the kind of dreams that young couples build together. We met in college. She was a psychology major, and I was studying business. It wasn't long before we were inseparable, spending every moment we could together. After graduation, we got married and started building our lives. We moved into a small house in the suburbs, the kind of place that screams American dream, with a white picket fence, a dog named Max, and two beautiful kids, Lucas and Emily. Over the years, we settled into a comfortable routine. I landed a decent job as a financial analyst, while Jessica took on the role of a stay-at-home mom, focusing on raising our kids and managing the household. She was always involved in everything they did, from PTA meetings to soccer games, while I took on the role of the provider, working long hours to ensure we had a good life. We had our ups and downs, as any couple does, but nothing that seemed insurmountable. At least, that's what I thought. Lately, though, things have been different. Jessica has become more distant, almost like she's living in a different world. She's spending more time on her phone, hiding the screen when I walk into the room, and going out with friends more often than usual. At first, I thought it was just a phase. Maybe she needed some time to herself after years of focusing on the kids and the house. I didn't want to be the overbearing husband, so I let it slide. But the signs kept piling up, small things that added to a growing sense of unease. It's hard to pinpoint the exact moment, and I realized something was seriously wrong. Maybe it was when she started dressing up more, putting on makeup and wearing clothes that she hadn't worn in years, all while claiming she was just going to run some errands. Or perhaps it was the late-night phone calls she would take outside, whispering into the receiver so I wouldn't hear. Every time I asked about it, she had a quick, believable excuse ready. Just a friend from the old neighborhood, she'd say, or, I'm planning a surprise for you, don't be nosy. But the more I tried to convince myself that everything was fine, the more that gnawing feeling in my gut told me otherwise. I started paying closer attention, noticing the way her behavior changed whenever she got a text message or when she'd come home after one of her so-called girls' nights. There was a coldness in her eyes, a lack of warmth that hadn't been there before. She wasn't just distant, she was absent, even when she was sitting right next to me. The hardest part was not knowing for sure. I wanted to believe that it was all in my head, that I was being paranoid. But deep down, I knew better. The woman I had spent nearly 2 decades with was slipping away from me, and I had no idea why. Was it something I did? Something I didn't do? The questions kept me up at night, tossing and turning as I tried to make sense of the situation. It wasn't until last Tuesday that I decided I couldn't take it anymore. I needed to know the truth, no matter how much it hurt. So, I started doing something I never thought I'd do, spying on my own wife. I felt like a fool, a paranoid idiot sneaking around in my own house. But I had to know. I had to find out if the woman I loved was betraying me, if our entire life together had become a lie. The moment of truth came quicker than I expected. One night, Jessica said she was going out with some friends, nothing unusual, just a quick dinner, she claimed. But something about the way she was acting set off alarms in my head. She seemed too eager to leave, too flustered as she grabbed her purse and practically ran out the door. I decided this was it, I needed to follow her. I waited a few minutes after she left, then grabbed my keys and followed her car from a distance. I felt ridiculous, like I was starring in some low-budget detective movie, but the need to know outweighed the embarrassment. I trailed her through the quiet streets of our suburban neighborhood, my heart pounding with every turn. She drove across town to a side of the city we didn't usually visit, eventually pulling into the parking lot of a hotel. At that moment, a wave of nausea hit me. This was it, the confirmation I had been dreading. She wasn't meeting friends, she was meeting someone else. I parked across the street, far enough away that she wouldn't notice me, and watched as she stepped out of her car. She was dressed to kill, in a way she hadn't dressed for me in years. My breath caught in my throat as I watched her walk towards the entrance, where a man was waiting for her. He was tall, well-dressed, and he greeted her with a kiss, on the lips. The kind of kiss that wasn't just friendly, but intimate, passionate. The sight of it hit me like a freight train. I felt my hands clench around the steering wheel, my knuckles turning white. I wanted to jump out of the car, run over there, and demand an explanation. But instead, I just sat there, frozen in disbelief. I watched as they walked into the hotel together, hand in hand, disappearing through the glass doors. It was like watching my life shatter in slow motion, piece by piece. I don't know how long I sat there in that parking lot, staring at the hotel, hoping that somehow this was all a bad dream. But the reality was undeniable. My wife, the mother of my children, was cheating on me. I finally drove home, the drive a blur of anger, sadness, and disbelief. When I got home, I went straight to our bedroom and sat on the edge of the bed, staring at the framed photos of our family on the nightstand. Each one felt like a mockery, a cruel reminder of the life I thought I had. The next morning, she came home acting like nothing had happened. She was chipper, even, humming as she made breakfast for the kids. I could barely look at her, the image of her with that man seared into my mind. When she leaned in to kiss me goodbye before taking the kids to school, I turned away, pretending to be engrossed in the morning paper. She hesitated for a moment, but then shrugged it off, grabbing her keys and heading out the door. As soon as she left, I knew I couldn't just let this slide. I had to confront her, but I needed more. I needed proof that would leave her with no room to deny or twist the truth. So, I did something I never imagined I'd do. I hired a private investigator. The decision made me feel sick, like I was betraying my own principles, but what choice did I have? I needed to know the full extent of her betrayal. A few days later, the investigator handed me a file. Photos, dates, times, all the evidence I needed was right there. She had been meeting this guy for months, sneaking off during the day when I was at work, and the kids were at school. The lies, the deception, it was all laid bare in front of me. The images of them together were like knives to the heart, each one cutting deeper than the last. Armed with this proof, I knew the time had come to confront Jessica. No more pretending, no more hoping that this was all some terrible misunderstanding. The woman I had loved and trusted had betrayed me in the worst way possible, and now, I had to face her with the truth. But before that confrontation could happen, I had to prepare myself for the storm that was about to hit. This wasn't just going to be a conversation, it was going to be a war. And I wasn't sure if I was ready for the battle ahead. When Jessica returned home that evening, she was in high spirits, talking about how she had run into an old friend at the store. Her voice was light, carefree even, as if she had no idea what was coming. It took everything in me to keep my expression neutral, to pretend for just a few more moments that I wasn't about to tear our life apart. The kids were in their rooms, finishing up homework, so I took the opportunity to pull Jessica aside. "We need to talk," I said, my voice firmer than I expected. She looked at me, her smile faltering slightly. "About what?" she asked, trying to maintain her casual demeanor, but there was a flicker of something in her eyes, fear, maybe, or guilt. "About us. About what you've been doing behind my back." The words hung in the air, heavy and accusatory. Jessica's face went pale. She blinked, caught off guard, but quickly recovered. "What are you talking about?" she said, her voice taking on a defensive edge. "I haven't done anything." I felt my hands tighten into fists at my sides, struggling to keep my temper in check. "Don't lie to me, Jessica. I know everything. The late-night outings, the secret phone calls, the hotel meetings. I know you've been cheating on me." Her eyes widened in shock, and for a brief moment, I saw the truth flash across her face. She knew she was caught. But then, like flipping a switch, her expression hardened. "You've been spying on me," she hissed, her voice low and venomous. "How dare you? You're the one who's out of line here, Steve. Invading my privacy like that. What kind of husband does that?" I couldn't believe what I was hearing. She was trying to turn this around on me, as if her betrayal was somehow justified by my need to find out the truth. Don't you dare try to twist this around, I shot back, my voice rising. I had to find out because you weren't telling me the truth. You've been lying to me, to our kids, and now you want to act like I'm the bad guy for finding out? She crossed her arms over her chest, her posture defiant. Maybe if you had been more attentive, this wouldn't have happened, she spat, her voice dripping with contempt. Do you ever think about that, Steve? You're always so busy with work, with your precious job, that you never have time for me anymore. What did you expect me to do? Sit around waiting for you to remember I exist? Her words stung, like a slap to the face, but I wasn't going to let her deflect responsibility. That's bullshit, and you know it, I snapped, stepping closer to her. I've been working my ass off to provide for this family, to give you and the kids everything you could ever want. But instead of appreciating that, you go off and find someone else to keep you company? Jessica's eyes flashed with anger, and she shoved me back with both hands. You think you're some kind of hero because you pay the bills? Guess what, Steve? Money doesn't buy happiness, and it sure as hell doesn't make up for the fact that you haven't touched me in months. You think I didn't notice? You've been checked out of this marriage for a long time, so don't act so surprised that I found someone who actually makes me feel wanted. I was stunned, almost knocked off balance by the force of her push, both physically and emotionally. For a moment, I couldn't find the words, the sheer audacity of her arguments rendering me speechless. But then, a surge of anger rose within me, pushing back against the wave of despair that threatened to overwhelm me. So, that's it? I said, my voice trembling with barely suppressed rage. You're blaming me for your affair? You're trying to justify fucking another man because I've been working hard to keep this family together? How dare you, Jessica? How fucking dare you? She scoffed, rolling her eyes as if I were the one being unreasonable. You're so predictable, Steve. Always the martyr, always the victim. You think you're the only one who's been suffering? I've been lonely for years, stuck in this house while you play the hero. I needed something more, something you weren't giving me. So, yeah, I found it somewhere else. And you know what? I don't regret it. Her words were like a knife to the heart, each one twisting deeper as she spoke. The woman standing in front of me was a stranger, cold and cruel, nothing like the woman I had married all those years ago. The realization that she truly didn't care, that she had no remorse for what she had done, hit me harder than any blow could have. I took a deep breath, trying to steady myself, but it was no use. The anger and pain were too much to contain. You don't regret it? I repeated, my voice shaking. You don't regret destroying our family, betraying me, betraying our kids? How can you say that? Jessica looked at me, her expression unyielding. Because it's the truth, Steve. I'm not going to apologize for wanting to be happy. And if that means being with someone else, then so be it. I felt like I was going to explode, the sheer arrogance of her words pushing me to the brink. Then why the hell didn't you just leave? I shouted. Why didn't you just divorce me and be done with it, instead of sneaking around like a coward? She didn't answer immediately, and for the first time, I saw a crack in her armor. Because, she finally said, her voice quieter now, I didn't want to hurt the kids. I didn't want to tear our family apart. Too late for that, I muttered, the bitterness in my voice unmistakable. You've already done that, Jessica. You destroyed everything we had, everything we built together. And for what? Some fling? Some guy who's probably using you just like you used me? Jessica's face twisted in anger, and she stepped closer, her finger jabbing into my chest. Don't you dare talk about him like that. He's a better man than you'll ever be. At least he knows how to treat a woman, how to make her feel special. I couldn't believe what I was hearing. This wasn't just an affair, this was an attack on everything I thought I knew about my marriage, about my wife. The rage that had been simmering beneath the surface boiled over, and before I knew it, I was shouting, my voice echoing through the house. Get out! I roared, my finger pointing towards the door. Get the fuck out of my house, Jessica! I don't want to see your face anymore. You want to be with him? Fine. Go be with him. But don't you dare come back here and expect everything to be okay. For a moment, she just stared at me, her eyes wide with shock. But then, just as quickly, her expression hardened again. Fine, she said coldly. I will. And you know what? You'll be sorry, Steve. You'll realize what you lost, but by then, it'll be too late. With that, she turned on her heel and stormed out of the house, slamming the door behind her. The sound echoed through the empty rooms, leaving behind a silence that was almost deafening. I stood there for a long time, staring at the door, my mind racing with everything that had just happened. I had confronted her, finally gotten the truth out in the open, but it didn't feel like a victory. It felt like the end of everything. The woman I had loved, the life we had built together, it was all gone, shattered beyond repair. And as I stood there in the silence, the full weight of that realization came crashing down on me, leaving me feeling utterly alone. After Jessica left that night, the house felt emptier than it had ever been. The kids were still in their rooms, oblivious to the storm that had just passed through their home, and I was left standing in the wreckage of my marriage. The anger I felt toward Jessica didn't fade after she walked out the door. Instead, it festered, growing darker and more intense with each passing hour. I spent the next few days in a daze, barely going through the motions of my daily life. The kids noticed, of course. They could sense that something was wrong, even if they didn't know the details. I tried to keep things as normal as possible for their sake, but inside, I was a mess. My mind kept replaying the confrontation with Jessica, her cold words, her unapologetic attitude, and it made my blood boil. I knew I couldn't let her get away with this. She had torn apart our family, shattered everything we had built, and then had the audacity to act like she was the victim. I wasn't going to let her walk away without facing the consequences of her actions. So, I started planning. It began with something simple, cutting off her access to our joint bank accounts. I couldn't stop her from seeing her lover, but I sure as hell could stop her from using my hard-earned money to fund their little escapades. I withdrew half of the funds, enough to cover my expenses and keep the kids comfortable, and moved it into a separate account that she couldn't touch. Next, I changed all the locks on the house. I didn't want her coming back and waltzing in as if nothing had happened. This was my home, and she wasn't welcome in it anymore. The thought of her being here, touching my things, living in the space we had shared, made me sick. So, I made sure she couldn't come back without a fight. But those were just the practical steps. I needed something more, something that would truly drive home the point that she had lost everything. I wanted her to feel the same pain she had caused me, to know what it was like to be betrayed by someone you trusted. That's when I came up with the idea to expose her affair publicly. It wasn't enough that I knew the truth, I wanted everyone to know what kind of person she really was. Jessica had always been concerned with appearances, always prided herself on being the perfect wife and mother. Well, I was going to tear down that facade and show the world who she really was. I started by gathering all the evidence I had, the photos, the text messages, everything the private investigator had uncovered. Then, I put together a dossier, a comprehensive account of her affair, and sent it to everyone she knew, her friends, her family, even her coworkers. I wanted them all to see the real Jessica, the one who had lied and cheated her way through our marriage. The fallout was immediate. Within hours of sending out the dossier, my phone started blowing up with calls and messages from people who had received it. Some were shocked, others were angry, and a few were even sympathetic, but they all had the same question: why? Why had Jessica done this? Why had she thrown away everything for some fling? Jessica, of course, was furious. She called me, screaming into the phone about how I had ruined her life, how I had turned everyone against her. But I didn't care. This was the price she had to pay for her betrayal, and I wasn't about to apologize for it. You brought this on yourself, Jessica, I told her, my voice cold and unyielding. You destroyed our family, and now everyone knows the truth. If you think you can just walk away from this unscathed, you're wrong. This is just the beginning. She tried to fight back, threatening to take me to court, to drag me through a messy divorce, but I was ready for that. I had already spoken to a lawyer, someone who specialized in cases like mine, and I knew my rights. She wasn't going to take me down without a fight, and I was more than prepared to go to war. But as satisfying as it was to watch her life crumble around her, I couldn't shake the emptiness inside me. Yes, I had gotten my revenge, but it didn't bring back what I had lost. It didn't erase the betrayal, the pain, the feeling of being completely and utterly alone. My life had been torn apart, and no amount of payback was going to change that. So, I focused on the one thing I could still control, my kids. I made sure they were taken care of, that they felt loved and supported, even as their world was turned upside down. I knew they were hurting, too, and I didn't want them to feel like they were caught in the crossfire of my battle with Jessica. But even as I tried to move forward, to focus on rebuilding my life, I couldn't shake the feeling that this was just the beginning. Jessica wasn't going to go down without a fight, and neither was I. This was far from over, and I knew that the next step in this twisted game was coming, whether I was ready for it or not. Jessica wasn't the only one who needed to face the consequences of this affair. There was another man out there, a man who had knowingly pursued a married woman, who had played a role in the destruction of my family. It wasn't enough to just punish Jessica, I wanted him to feel the full weight of what he had done as well. I had already done my homework. The private investigator I hired had provided me with everything I needed to know about this guy. His name was Kyle Anderson, a 38-year-old marketing executive who worked at a nearby firm. He was single, lived in a high-rise apartment downtown, and, from what I gathered, had a reputation as a bit of a womanizer. It made sense, he was the type of guy who thought he could have anything he wanted, no matter the cost. I decided to start by gathering more information. If there was one thing I learned from my time in business, it was that information is power. The more I knew about Kyle, the better I could plan my next move. So, I began to dig deeper into his life. Social media accounts, work history, even his financials, I left no stone unturned. What I found painted a picture of a man who was, on the surface, successful and confident, but underneath, he was living way beyond his means. Multiple credit cards maxed out, a mortgage that was eating him alive, and a lifestyle that was more about appearances than reality. This was a man who couldn't afford to have his life disrupted, who had built his entire identity around the image of success. I knew exactly how to hit him where it hurt. The first step was to undermine his professional life. I contacted several people in his industry, posing as a potential client, and started spreading rumors about his questionable business practices. Nothing too outlandish, just enough to sow seeds of doubt in the minds of his colleagues and clients. I hinted that he was involved in some shady deals, that he was taking shortcuts to close contracts, that he wasn't someone to be trusted. In the cutthroat world of marketing, even a small blemish on your reputation can be enough to cause serious damage, and I made sure those rumors reached the right ears. Next, I focused on his finances. With the information I had gathered, I knew exactly how precarious his situation was. I made a few anonymous tips to the right people, his bank, the credit card companies he was indebted to, even the IRS. Suddenly, Kyle found himself under scrutiny, his accounts frozen, and his financial troubles piling up faster than he could manage. The lifestyle he had worked so hard to maintain was crumbling, and there was nothing he could do about it. But I wasn't done yet. I wanted him to feel the same sense of betrayal that I had felt. So, I found a way to contact his boss, anonymously, of course. I sent an email with all the details of his affair with Jessica, making sure to emphasize how it was impacting his work. I even attached some of the photos the investigator had taken, just to drive the point home. The last thing any company wants is to be associated with a scandal, especially one that involves infidelity. I knew that Kyle's boss would be concerned about how this might reflect on their firm, and I was counting on it. Sure enough, it wasn't long before Kyle started feeling the pressure. He was called into meetings, his projects were reassigned, and he found himself being pushed to the sidelines at work. His once promising career was unraveling, and there was nothing he could do to stop it. He was drowning in debt, his reputation was in tatters, and he was on the verge of losing everything he had worked for. I wanted to see the effects of my actions firsthand, so one day, I decided to pay Kyle a visit. I waited until the end of the workday, watching from my car as he left his office. He looked stressed, his usual confident swagger replaced by a tense, hurried walk. I followed him to a nearby bar, where he sat alone, nursing a drink and staring into the middle distance. It was clear that the weight of everything was bearing down on him, and I couldn't help but feel a grim sense of satisfaction. I didn't approach him that night. I wanted him to stew in his own misery for a while longer. But as I sat there, watching him, I realized that I needed to make one final move, something that would leave a lasting impression. Something that would ensure he never forgot the consequences of his actions. The next day, I went to the apartment complex where Kyle lived. It was an upscale building, the kind of place where image was everything. I waited until I saw him leave for work, then approached the building manager. I told him I was an old friend of Kyle's who had come into town unexpectedly and wanted to leave him a little surprise. I handed him an envelope stuffed with cash and asked him to let me into Kyle's apartment for just a few minutes. The manager was hesitant at first, but the sight of that much money in his hand quickly changed his mind. Once inside Kyle's apartment, I went to work. I planted a series of documents and fake evidence that made it look like Kyle was involved in some illegal activities, money laundering, fraud, you name it. I even left a few strategically placed business cards from known criminal defense attorneys, just to make it look more convincing. I knew that once Kyle saw this, he'd be in full panic mode, and he'd have no idea who was behind it or what to do. I left the apartment, locking the door behind me, and went home to wait. Sure enough, it didn't take long for things to unravel even further for Kyle. I heard through the grapevine that his apartment had been raided by the police after an anonymous tip-off, and while they didn't find anything conclusive, the experience was enough to send Kyle spiraling into paranoia. He started missing work, avoiding his colleagues, and generally acting like a man who was running scared. His life was falling apart, and he was powerless to stop it. A few weeks later, I got a call from my private investigator. He told me that Kyle had checked into a rehab facility, citing stress and substance abuse issues. It seemed that everything I had done had pushed him to the brink, and now he was trying to escape from the mess he had made of his life. Hearing this, I felt a mix of emotions. On the one hand, I was satisfied that I had achieved what I set out to do. Kyle's life was in ruins, and he was paying the price for what he had done. But on the other hand, I couldn't help but feel a hollow emptiness inside me. I had destroyed this man's life, but it didn't bring back what I had lost. It didn't erase the pain or heal the wounds that Jessica's betrayal had caused. But there was no turning back now. I had crossed a line, and I had to live with the consequences of my actions. I had exacted my revenge on Kyle, but at what cost? The man I saw in the mirror every day was no longer the man I used to be. The anger and bitterness had changed me, made me into someone I barely recognized. And as much as I wanted to believe that I had done the right thing, I couldn't shake the feeling that I had lost a part of myself in the process. The fallout from the revenge I had taken on Jessica and Kyle lingered for weeks, casting a shadow over everything I did. The kids could sense the tension in the house, the way I was on edge all the time, and it affected them too. They became quieter, more withdrawn, and I hated that they were caught up in the middle of this mess. I tried to be there for them as much as I could, to shield them from the ugliness of what was happening, but it was impossible to keep it all away. Jessica, of course, hadn't gone quietly. She had fought back, as I knew she would. She hired a lawyer and started the process of filing for divorce, dragging me into a legal battle that was as bitter as it was exhausting. We fought over everything: money, custody of the kids, even the house. Every conversation we had was laced with anger and resentment, and there was no room for compromise. One evening, after yet another heated argument over the phone, Jessica showed up at the house unannounced. The kids were at my parents' place for the weekend, so it was just the two of us. She looked tired, worn out by the constant fighting, but there was still a fire in her eyes that told me she wasn't ready to give up. "We need to talk," she said, her voice firm but not unkind. "About what?" I replied, keeping my tone as neutral as possible. I wasn't in the mood for another shouting match. About everything, she sighed, stepping into the living room and sitting down on the couch. About where we go from here. I stayed standing, crossing my arms over my chest. You mean about how we're going to tear each other apart in court? She shook her head, a weary smile tugging at the corners of her mouth. I don't want to do that anymore, Steve. I'm tired. Aren't you tired? I stared at her, surprised by her words. For the first time in a long time, she didn't seem angry or defensive. She just seemed defeated. Yeah, I admitted after a moment. I am. Jessica nodded, running a hand through her hair. This isn't what I wanted, Steve. I never wanted it to get this bad. I don't know how we got here. You don't know? I asked, a hint of sarcasm creeping into my voice. Maybe it had something to do with you cheating on me. She winced at my words but didn't argue. I'm not saying I didn't make mistakes. I did. Big ones. But this fighting, this revenge, it's destroying both of us. And it's hurting the kids. I sighed, feeling the weight of her words. She was right. As much as I hated to admit it, this war we were waging was tearing us both apart, and the kids were caught in the crossfire. They deserved better than this. What do you want, Jessica? I asked, my voice softer now. I want to end this, she said, looking up at me with tired eyes. I want to find a way to move on, for all of us. We can't keep doing this, Steve. It's not good for anyone. I sat down across from her, feeling the tension in my shoulders begin to ease just slightly. So, what do we do? We settle the divorce amicably, she said, her tone serious. No more fighting over every little thing. We come to an agreement that's fair to both of us. We focus on co-parenting the kids, making sure they know they're still loved, no matter what happens between us. I listened to her, weighing her words. It wasn't going to be easy, but maybe she was right. Maybe it was time to stop fighting and start thinking about what was best for our kids. And Kyle? I asked, unable to keep the bitterness out of my voice. She sighed, looking away for a moment. He's out of my life. He has been for a while. I realize now that what I had with him wasn't real. It was a mistake, and I'm sorry for the pain it caused you. Her apology caught me off guard. It was the first time she had ever expressed any kind of remorse for what she had done. Part of me wanted to lash out, to tell her that it was too little, too late, but another part of me was just tired of being angry. Okay, I said quietly. Let's do this. Let's end it on our terms, not in a courtroom. She looked relieved, almost as if she hadn't expected me to agree so easily. Thank you, Steve. We spent the next hour talking, really talking, for the first time in months. We hashed out the details of the divorce, agreeing to split custody of the kids and divide our assets fairly. It wasn't a perfect solution, but it was one we could both live with. As we talked, the bitterness between us began to fade, replaced by a sense of resignation. We were both just trying to survive this, to find some way to move forward. When Jessica finally left that night, we didn't say goodbye. There was no need. We both knew that this was the end, the final chapter of our life together. And as I watched her drive away, I felt a strange mix of sadness and relief. Sadness for what we had lost, but relief that the fighting was finally over. The weeks that followed were a blur of paperwork, meetings with lawyers, and difficult conversations with the kids. Explaining the divorce to them was one of the hardest things I've ever had to do. They were confused, hurt, and scared, and it broke my heart to see them like that. But I did my best to reassure them, to let them know that no matter what happened between Jessica and me, we both still loved them and would always be there for them. Jessica and I stuck to our agreement, finalizing the divorce without any further drama. We each took responsibility for our own lives, working out a co-parenting schedule that allowed the kids to spend time with both of us. It wasn't the life I had envisioned for our family, but it was the best we could do under the circumstances. I started seeing a therapist to help me work through the anger and pain that still lingered. It wasn't an easy process, and there were days when I felt like I was drowning in my own emotions. But slowly, with time and effort, I began to heal. I started focusing on myself, on rebuilding my life in a way that was healthy and positive. I spent more time with the kids, threw myself into work, and even picked up some old hobbies that I had neglected over the years. Jessica and I maintained a cordial relationship for the sake of the kids, but there was no going back to what we had before. Too much had been broken, and while we had both made our peace with it, the wounds were too deep to ever fully heal. As for Kyle, I heard through the grapevine that he had lost his job and was struggling to get back on his feet. Part of me still felt a sense of satisfaction at the thought of his downfall, but another part of me just wanted to move on. I had gotten my revenge, but it hadn't brought me the closure I was hoping for. In the end, it was just another reminder that revenge might feel good in the moment, but it doesn't solve the deeper issues. A year after the divorce was finalized, I found myself standing in the backyard of my new home, a smaller, cozier place that I had bought to start fresh. The kids were running around, laughing and playing, and for the first time in a long time, I felt at peace. The journey to this point had been long and painful, but it had also been necessary. I had learned a lot about myself, about the importance of trust, communication, and self-care. I had made mistakes, and I had suffered because of them, but I had also grown stronger as a result. Jessica and I had managed to establish a stable co-parenting relationship, and while we would never be friends, we had both moved on with our lives. She had started dating again, and while the thought of it still stung a little, I was okay with it. I had accepted that our marriage was over and that it was time for both of us to find happiness elsewhere. As for me, I had taken the time to focus on myself and my kids. I wasn't ready to jump into another relationship just yet, but I was open to the possibility in the future. For now, I was content with the life I was building, one that was rooted in honesty, self-respect, and a determination to never let anyone take advantage of me again. As the sun set over the horizon, casting a warm glow over the backyard, I felt a sense of closure. The past was behind me, and while it had shaped who I was, it no longer defined me. I was free to create a new future, one that was filled with hope, love, and the knowledge that I was strong enough to overcome anything life threw my way. Life had thrown me a curveball, but I had caught it, and now I was ready to play the game on my own terms. And as I watched my kids play, their laughter echoing through the air, I knew that I had made it through the storm and come out stronger on the other side.